Right. When it comes to the use of social media, do you think the impact on political participation and people's views around issues and democracy and their own politics, do you think the impact of social media is the same or will be the same in countries like the US and the UK versus countries more seen to be in the developing world? So, Kenya, for example, do you think in areas where there's significantly perhaps stronger ethnic or religious groups that social media would have the same effect or different effects on political participation?
I mean, I think there are certain things that are quite common where social media has high penetration. So, a country like Kenya, which has very high internet penetration, high social media penetration because of the availability of smartphones and the quality of the network.
Right.
There are many ways in which we might expect social media to work in similar ways, at least when it comes to the risk of, the circulation of fake news and misinformation and the way that can distort perceptions. There are, of course, a certain set of things that then play into that, which are, your inherent social structures. In the US, of course, race is playing into that a lot, especially around the Black Lives Matter protests. In a country like Kenya, it will be ethnicity and assumptions about ethnicity that play into that more. I think one of the big questions we have and that we don't know enough about is to what extent does social media reproduce ethnic tensions and cleavages, and to what extent does it overcome them? So are you predominantly in a WhatsApp group if you're a Kikuyu from the Kikuyu community? Are you predominantly in a WhatsApp group with other Kikuyus? Are you predominantly following other Kikuyus on Twitter? Are you predominantly friends with other Kikuyus on Facebook? In which case social media is kind of replicating existing networks of ethnic ties and communication. Or are you actually drawn into networks and organizations and ties and websites that bring you into contact with a range of Kenyans from lots of different ethnic groups, and in doing so do you form different attachments that take you out of your ethnic community? And of course, the more that sort of things happens, we probably think the healthier social media is for kind of breaking down those barriers and building towards a common national identity. And I think we don't have enough evidence right now exactly of how much that's happening. As I said, we did sort of assume that a lot of the problem with social media was that it kind of ghettoized people, that people weren't simply engaging in the same social media, they were picking and choosing their social media. But recently there's been a lot of research pushing back against that and saying that actually it's more fluid than that suggests. I think the other thing to keep in mind, though, in our research on the use of, for example, WhatsApp in Nigeria really brings this out, is that, these things are not always revolutionary. They don't always completely change the game. And what political leaders tell us in places like Nigeria is, sure, they use WhatsApp to communicate because they're going to use everything they can to communicate. And it's a very effective mechanism because it can reach a lot of people. But one, it's quite hard to control WhatsApp. You actually have to go to a lot of work to put together all those groups to be able to communicate to people effectively through WhatsApp. Two, it's not always easy to control the message. You can put a message out, but the message that trends that day might be a catchier message put out by the opposition or a different leader. And three, actually, for most candidates, WhatsApp is not what's going to win them an election. It's important to have a WhatsApp campaign and to push messages out that way and to counteract fake news that comes about you that way. But most candidates still tell us that you win elections by being present on the ground, by being authentic, by being seen by your community, by contributing to local development projects, by having a reputation as being a good person and somebody who's there and supports the community. And if you don't have any of those things, the WhatsApp campaign isn't going to win you the election. And if you have all of those things, not having a WhatsApp campaign is probably not going to lose you the election. So I think it's also important to keep in mind that while social media is really important, it doesn't necessarily replace kind of traditional mechanisms like rallies, knocking on people's doors, being locally present, listening to people's concerns as the central way in which you fight elections. It's become one of the range of strategies that leaders use rather than the only strategy that leaders use.
Do you think social media has made it easier or more difficult for leaders to take more authoritarian tactics or even authoritarian regimes themselves to continue? Or is there examples?
That's another great question. I think these are exactly the questions we need to be asking, because what all of your questions today kind of point at is that none of these things have one simple effect. right? Social media doesn't simply have a positive or negative effect on democracy. And one of the things we argued in a recent journal article we published in the Journal of Democracy is that, social media, WhatsApp, basically have a disruptive effect. They can disrupt hierarchies. For example, 20 years ago, under, say, a military regime or a one-party state, let's say the mid-1980s, a bit further ago, the government would have a fairly strong monopoly over the use of radio, the use of TV and newspapers. People might be able to get BBC World Service, something like that, French radio, but in general, the main domestic media would be controlled by the government. And you couldn't contest that very effectively. And nowadays, the government can still have the upper hand because the government has a bigger budget, might be able to intimidate people, might be able to shut down the internet, might be able to pass legislation that allows it to censor people and arrest people for putting messages about the president online and so on. So the government in some way still has an upper hand, but it's easier for the opposition to counteract that, because whereas in the days of state-dominated TV and radio, you had no right of reply. No one was going to allow you to push your message on radio. No one was going to allow you column inches in the newspaper. All of a sudden, they can go on Twitter and Facebook and WhatsApp and push their alternative messages. And if their messages actually have greater resonance, there's not much the government can do, short of actually shutting down the internet and bringing the whole system down to reassert control. So I think you're absolutely right. It's not simply one way. We've seen a disruption of kind of existing hierarchies of media. We've also seen, interestingly, it seems to be the case from our work that, for example, women, particularly in communities where women were not expected to be so politically active traditionally, have used social media and WhatsApp and the anonymity of that and the ability to participate in debates at home through social media to actually play a bigger political role than they were doing in the past. So potentially a bit of a disruption there of gender hierarchies, maybe of age hierarchies, because younger people are more adept at social media. Right. So they're being drafted into political campaigns to run social media campaigns for candidates. So maybe a bit of a disruption of media, age and gender hierarchies. But the government can still reassert control and clamp down. And as we've seen recently in Zimbabwe, the government has responded to a growing sort of campaign against its abuses on social media by arresting and putting into prison prominent journalists. Right. And, the more the government does that, the more people get intimidated, the more journalists are in prison, they can't be on social media. And so, the government can attempt to wrest back control of this process relatively quickly. So I think it's, again, it's one of those questions where the answer is it's really subtle and complicated and nuanced. It has given opposition parties a new lease of life. It has created new options for civil society. In more democratic and more open societies, that is making a really big difference. But governments still have more resources and the ability to clamp down. And where they do so, it may almost turn out to be the other way around. And I say that, for example, because we know that there are governments in Africa who spend a lot of money effectively employing people to go on social media and look like ordinary citizens, but pump out positive messages about themselves. And then, of course, we have, the issue of bots and so on. And so one of the things that we also have to keep in mind is that social media isn't this neutral space where everybody is an average citizen and, the average of social media commentary is really public opinion about the government. Because it could be that what we're seeing on social media is a lot of people who are paid to go on social media to make the government look good. Equally, of course, opposition parties are paying their people to do the same thing. So I think one of the things we also need to be careful of as almost an international community, international media, is not to read off what we say, what we see on our Twitter feed as being the actual feelings of the population of the country concerned. They may be, but they may all also be being distorted. And it's really important to go beyond the kind of Twitter sphere and the WhatsApp sphere to actually really interrogate, how representative is social media of the wider population? Right. To what extent do we know the government is trying to manipulate this? How many of the people who are sharing our messages are trolls or bots? How many of them are real citizens? And the problem with that, of course, is you need to do that on a case-by-case basis. So I think we should, welcome social media and the disruption of those hierarchies. That is something that can really help to strengthen democracy. But we should also be aware that, like all technology, it can also be appropriated and controlled by the government.
Right. One question final question on social media and democracy, but one, when I was discussing with some people that I would be talking to you today, one question that came up a couple of times was whether or not, often I think people in the UK, for example, my friends will sit and watch things going on in Zimbabwe, for example, and see a hashtag running like, say, Zimbabwean Lives Matter. and sort of get involved in that, but wonder what kind of impact does that really have, and does it really have an impact if you're at home in the UK and writing hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter? Does it really have an impact? Does it strengthen the movement over there? Does the Zimbabwean regime really care if the West has that tag running on their Twitter sphere, or is it kind of moot and we're sort of wasting our time with desktop?
It's a great question. I think essentially what I would say is that it is a positive. We had a show on the Resistance Bureau, was sort of discussion space and podcast I'm involved in. We had a show on Zimbabwean Lives Matter, and we asked exactly this question: does it just make us feel better? Right? We can click Zimbabwean Lives Matter, we can retweet, and we feel we've done something when in fact we've probably done very little. And does it really make a difference? And I think it does make a difference in two ways. I mean, one, it increases the profile of the abuses in the country. It encourages journalists to cover them. It encourages also newspaper editors to put stories higher up. Because if you're seeing millions of people retweeting a hashtag, you think there's a constituency for the story, and you're more likely to put that story higher up, in your newspaper or closer to the front page, etc., than if you don't. You might give more column inches to a story on it, for example. So I think in those ways it does help. It also, to some extent, can help to galvanize international opinion. We talked a bit about the problems of doing that during the pandemic, but it can help to do that. Yeah. And also, I think, and this is something Doug Coltart, who's a human rights lawyer who works with many of the people who've been detained and abused during the recent crackdown in Zimbabwe. One of the things he said on the show, which was, there is a really important effect of solidarity. Coming to trial in a court and being led out and seeing your supporters in the court giving you strength is a big thing. Knowing that there are people all around the world who are thinking of you and caring about you and listening to Zimbabwe is a big thing for the kind of ability of people who are risking their lives on a daily basis to keep going. So I think in all those ways it is a good and important thing. But you're right, we should be cautious. Right. Because it's also true that it only really changes governments' behavior if governments are sensitive to what publics think. Right. There are governments all over the world that crave public opinion. And if they saw a hashtag campaign that was that successful, they would have jumped 5 days ago in terms of their policy. Yeah. ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe is not one of those governments. President Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe is not one of those leaders. And so he's not going to be swayed simply because Zimbabwe is being embarrassed by campaign about how bad the government is. And so, there is there a real question about, is this actually going to drive significant change? Many of us have been hoping to see the release of prominent journalist Hopo Chirono, who's a sort of friend and anti-corruption leader in his own right. And, despite all of the campaigns, all of the hashtags, Free Hopewell as a hashtag as well as Zimbabwean Lives Matter, he still remains in jail as the government manipulates the law and misapplies the law to create excuses to keep him in jail rather than releasing him. So, on some of the big issues and biggest asks of the Zimbabwean Lives Matter campaign, we haven't yet seen the government do anything. So I think what we have to see it as is not something that's going to force the government to sort of be better itself, but it's going to build stronger bonds of solidarity within and outside of Zimbabwe. And hopefully those bonds will amount to something more, not just the hashtag, but maybe more donations to Zimbabwean human rights organizations, maybe more expressions of help and solidarity from organizations outside of Zimbabwe, for sister organizations in Zimbabwe. And hopefully at some point galvanizing international community to take the situation in Zimbabwe more seriously and to apply more pressure. And maybe that combination of things leads to change. But of course, as we saw under Robert Mugabe during his time in charge, especially towards the end of his time in charge in Zimbabwe, a really stubborn leader who is unprepared to compromise can stay in power for quite a long time if he retains the support of the security forces and the military. Right. And I think that's where the final interesting piece of the puzzle might come in. Will it be the case that social media and the criticism of ZANU-PF and the president on social media will become so great and combined with criticism in the country that the security forces might decide to do away with his services themselves? Right. Might that be one of the kind of unintended consequences of this? Right. But as you say, we should be cautious, because it's certainly not true that a successful social media campaign in terms of hashtags and retweets necessarily translates into anything on the ground.
Right. In regards to abuse of female MPs, but political abuse generally on social media, how do you think democracies all placed in terms of controlling social media? So obviously there's been some discussion in terms of with fake news, should democracies be more involved in putting restrictions on social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter? But do you think then that undermines democratic freedom of speech? Like should democracies stand on preventing the abuse of social media?
This is a very complicated one, because, of course, those of us who believe in civil liberties and democracy are loath to do anything that would clamp down on free speech and that would allow governments to censor. And to return to the research we did in Nigeria, even those people who are very critical of social media in the opposition, even they were saying, don't allow government to control this. The way to resolve this is not to give governments more power to say who can speak and who can't, because they were sure that that was going to be manipulated, not to protect people, not to stamp out hate speech, but to silence voices that were critical of the government. So I think we really do have to take seriously that importance of not censoring as a knee-jerk reaction, not simply giving governments the power to regulate directly in that way. Not, for example, not forcing WhatsApp to make all users and all messages visible to the government. That said, I also think that we have a lot of laws in most countries, certainly in advanced democracies, around what is not allowed. What is not allowed during a campaign. Racism is not allowed. Consistent sexism is not allowed. Death threats are not allowed. Homophobia is not allowed. We should be policing the social media space in the same way we are policing the non-social media space. If somebody who would stand up at a meeting and call a female or a black or a gay candidate a name would be arrested and talked to by the police, and the same person doing that online should be talked to by the police. And I think there's obviously places where it's going to be very difficult to do that, WhatsApp, etc. But people who are doing that over Twitter, who are doing that over Facebook, whose names and identities can be discovered, I think we should be prosecuting them the same way we would be if it was not on social media. And my sense is that if we started doing that much more aggressively, much more effectively, only, of course, where we have evidence, but where we have evidence doing it and really clamping down and making examples of those cases, we would start to see people thinking more carefully about what they say online. It wouldn't be a silver bullet. It wouldn't stop the abuse. I don't think anything's going to completely stop it. But I think we have to start to move towards that. And simply enforcing the rules that we already have doesn't require additional legislation. It just requires some money to be spent on this and new ways of working that actually allow us to effectively find people who are doing it and make sure that they don't do it again. I think that has to be done in conjunction, of course, with social media companies. A very basic thing that could be done is that an individual who is found to have done this might be banned from having an account on Twitter for a longer period of time as a way of taking some of those people off social media, not forever, but maybe for 6 months. Maybe if they do it again, they're taken off for a year or two, maybe then a 5-year ban and then a life ban. Things like that can actually start to fight back. And I do think social media companies, but also governments, need to put more money into effectively responding to this. And I think if they do so, we could start to make a bit of a difference. And that would be a much more preferable solution to straightforward censorship.